Prepare to witness 6 real-life encounters where humans come face-to-face with nature's most fearsome predators. From savage grizzly ambushes deep in Montana's wilderness to sloth bears lashing out in the jungles of India, these stories reveal just how thin the line is between survival and catastrophe. In this video, we'll uncover 6 terrifying animal attacks, true accounts that push human courage, instinct, and resilience to the brink. The morning of June 25, 2025, began like so many others for Lucas Meyer, a veteran park ranger with nearly 2 decades of service deep in a national park in northwestern Montana. He moved quietly through the woods beneath a pale gray sky, the early light struggling to cut through the mist that clung to the canyon walls. His boots crunched softly over gravel as he made his way along a narrow trail lined with spruce and lichen-covered stone, the silence broken only by the occasional chirp of distant birds and the whisper of wind through pine needles. Lucas had walked this path dozens of times before, checking trail conditions and wildlife movements after a recent storm. But on this day, just beyond a sharp bend in the trail, everything changed in an instant. He rounded the corner and stopped dead. 20 yards ahead, a massive grizzly bear stood hunched over the torn carcass of a freshly killed mule deer, its fur soaked in blood, jaws working through tendons and ribs with methodical force. The bear looked up, its snout dripping red, and its eyes locked onto his. Lucas froze. The bear let out a low, guttural growl, a sound more felt than heard, then rose onto its hind legs, towering above the dead animal. There was no hesitation. It roared once, loud and violent, then dropped to all fours and charged with terrifying speed. Lucas instinctively stepped back, raising one hand slowly while his other reached for the canister of bear spray strapped to his chest. But the terrain betrayed him. The trail narrowed sharply beside a steep ledge, and as he tried to retreat, his heel slipped on loose gravel. The world tilted. A moment later, he was falling. He tumbled roughly down a 15-foot drop, crashing through brush and landing hard among jagged rocks at the base of the canyon wall. Pain shot through his back and ribs as he gasped for air, his vision flickering at the edges. But there was no time to assess the damage. Above, the grizzly roared again and came crashing down the slope after him. It hit him like a truck. The bear landed with its full weight on top of him, its claws tearing into his uniform and its teeth sinking deep into his left shoulder. The force of the bite sent hot, blinding pain through his entire body. He screamed, his voice echoing through the narrow canyon as blood poured from the wound. The bear reared back, then struck again, slamming its paw into his chest and pinning him against the rocks. Lucas clawed desperately at the slick moss beneath him, one hand fumbling across the stones in search of the bear spray. The canister had been torn loose in the fall, and now every movement was agony. His fingers finally closed around the metal tube just as the bear lunged again, jaws snapping inches from his throat. He raised the spray and fired blindly. The cloud hit the bear square in the face. The reaction was instant. The grizzly reeled back with a violent shake of its head, coughing and growling as the burning mist seared its eyes and nose. Lucas kept spraying until the can hissed empty, his arm trembling, his vision swimming. The bear staggered, snarling in fury and confusion, then turned and crashed back up the slope, vanishing into the trees. Silence fell again, broken only by Lucas's ragged breaths and the distant rustle of branches. His shoulder throbbed with every heartbeat. Blood ran down his chest, pooling into the rocky earth beneath him. He couldn't feel the tips of his fingers on one side, and pain radiated from his ribs like fire. But he was alive, and he knew he had to move. For nearly an hour, Lucas dragged himself inch by inch back toward the trail. Every movement sent fresh pain shooting through his body, but he gritted his teeth and kept going. The climb back up the ledge felt endless. More than once he slipped and fell, reopening wounds and cracking bruised ribs against the unforgiving stone. His radio had been smashed in the fall, and no help was coming. It was up to him. By the time he reached the ranger station, the sun had begun its climb above the treetops, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. Lucas staggered through the door, his face pale, eyes wild, and collapsed onto the floor. His colleagues rushed to him, calling for medics, trying to stop the bleeding, but the damage was done, not just to his body, but to something deeper. Later at the hospital, Doctors treated his wounds and stabilized his condition. They told him he'd need months of physical therapy, that he was lucky to be alive. But Lucas didn't hear much of it. All he could think about was the moment he'd looked into the bear's eyes and seen something primal and unstoppable staring back. The next morning, while still recovering, Lucas submitted his resignation. He told no long story, gave no explanation, and asked for no ceremony. His mind was made up. After everything he had endured in the wilderness, storms, rescues, close calls with moose and wolves, nothing had ever come close to what he faced that day. Something in him had changed forever. The forest that had once felt like home now felt like a place he could never return to. He left the national park behind, trading boots and rifles for silence and distance, carrying with him the scars of survival and a memory that would never quite let him go. The dawn air hung cold and damp over Kodiak Island in August 2024, the fog still thick as it rolled lazily off the Pacific waves and into the rocky coves. Luke Harper, a rugged fisherman in his early 30s, had been up since before first light, intent on checking his nets along a remote shoreline far from the small village where he lived. The rocks were slick with seaweed, and the tide was pulling out fast, leaving pools of salt water glistening like glass in the early morning haze. Luke moved carefully, his boots slipping occasionally on the uneven stones, hands busy hauling the heavy nylon mesh from the water, checking for trapped fish or damaged lines. The area was familiar. He had fished these waters every summer since he was a boy, and knew the rhythms of the tide, the patterns of salmon runs, and the habits of the wildlife around him. But that morning, something was different. The dense brush at the edge of the cove, thick with alder and spruce, seemed unnaturally still. Luke glanced up, sensing movement out of the corner of his eye. From the tangled thicket emerged a massive Kodiak bear, an enormous male with a coat that gleamed wet in the mist, muscles rippling beneath thick fur, and eyes that seemed to study the shoreline with unsettling calm. This bear was larger than any Luke had seen in recent memory, easily close to 10 feet tall when standing upright, a colossus of raw power. It moved slowly, without haste or panic. Unlike the usual defensive behavior where bears bolt at the first sign of human presence, this one seemed deliberate, curious almost. The hairs on the back of Luke's neck rose, and his breath caught in his throat. He froze, the net slipping from his hands. The bear's gaze fixed on him, unwavering. For a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them, the man and the predator, locked in an uneasy standoff on the rocky shore. Then, without warning, the bear lowered its massive head and charged. Luke barely had time to react. The bear barreled forward with the speed of a freight train, closing the gap in seconds. It slammed into him, driving him against a jagged boulder jutting from the shore. The impact crushed the air from his lungs, and pain exploded through his left shoulder as the bear's powerful jaws clamped down, teeth sinking deep into muscle and bone. He could hear the sickening crack of bone beneath the crushing pressure, and blood poured down his arm, hot and sticky. Pain blurred his vision, but Luke fought back. Adrenaline surged through his veins, numbing the worst of the agony as he thrashed, punching the bear's snout with every ounce of strength he had left. His fists hammered the bear's sensitive nose again and again, desperate to force it to release its grip. The bear growled, but didn't loosen. Nearby, other fishermen working along the shore heard the frantic cries. They dropped their gear and sprinted toward the commotion, shouting and grabbing handfuls of rocks. They hurled stones at the bear, yelling and making as much noise as possible to scare it off. For a few tense minutes, the standoff raged. Finally, the bear reeled back, snarling and shaking its head to clear the pain of the spray and blows to its face. With one last look at Luke, it turned and vanished back into the forest, its heavy footsteps fading beneath the dense canopy. Luke collapsed onto the stones, trembling, his body racked with pain and shock. His shoulder throbbed relentlessly, the deep wounds oozing blood that pooled beneath him, mingling with salt water and grit. His breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale stabbing through broken ribs and crushed muscles. It was only after several minutes that he managed to reach his radio and call for emergency assistance. By the time the helicopter arrived, a rescue team was already on its way, guided by the location coordinates Luke had managed to send through the static. They found him weak but conscious, wrapped in a thermal blanket, surrounded by the grim evidence of the attack. The torn fishing nets, blood-streaked rocks, and broken branches. The medical crew wasted no time stabilizing Luke and lifting him to safety, the rotor blades chopping through the cold Alaskan air as they sped toward the nearest hospital. The diagnosis was severe: multiple broken bones in his shoulder and ribs, deep puncture wounds, and extensive tissue damage that would require surgery and months of rehabilitation. Doctors called his survival miraculous, attributing it to his quick thinking and the intervention of his fellow fishermen, whose timely arrival had likely saved his life. Wildlife experts from the Fish and Game authorities later examined the incident with concern. They noted that while Kodiak bears were generally shy and avoided humans, the unusual aggression displayed that day was rare but not unheard of. The region had been experiencing significant food shortages that year due to disrupted salmon runs and drought affecting berry crops, the staple diet for many bears during late summer. The bear's behavior may have been driven by desperation, pushing it to approach human-occupied areas more boldly in search of food. The experts emphasized that even experienced locals and fishermen should exercise extreme caution, especially in familiar fishing spots where the presence of wildlife can change suddenly and unpredictably. Luke himself, once deeply connected to the wild shores of Kodiak, was left shaken by the attack. His recovery was slow, and while he resolved to return to fishing eventually, a shadow had settled over his relationship with the land and sea. He spoke quietly of the thin line between respect and danger that defines life in Alaska's wild places, and how quickly it can be crossed when nature is pushed to its limits. The attack on that rocky shore was a stark reminder that no one, no matter how experienced, is truly safe in the presence of a creature driven by hunger and survival. It was a brutal lesson etched in broken bone and blood, a story to warn others who venture into the wild, where the balance between man and beast remains fragile and unpredictable. The morning of August 12, 2024, was cold and gray in Russia's remote Amur region, where dense forests stretched unbroken for miles, and wild creatures ruled the shadows beneath towering pines. 3 female police officers, Irina Volkova, Svetlana Morozova, and Anna Petrov, had been dispatched to investigate a suspected homicide near the edge of this vast wilderness. The locals had reported a foul, unsettling odor lingering near a remote trail, and the officers were tasked with locating and documenting any evidence, no matter how grim. Arriving before dawn, the 3 officers prepared themselves for a long day in difficult terrain. Their small, unmarked SUV rattled along rutted dirt roads, finally coming to a halt near the forest's edge. They carried cameras, notebooks, and sidearms, fully aware of the dangers lurking in such an isolated place, not just from potential suspects, but from the untamed wilderness itself. The forest was dense, thick with spruce, fir, and birch. The ground beneath their feet was soft and damp from recent rains, leaves and needles cushioning their footsteps as they carefully followed a narrow path toward the area where the stench was strongest. Every so often, birds would break the eerie silence with nervous calls, and the wind whispered faintly through the treetops. But the forest seemed unusually still that morning, as if holding its breath. After nearly an hour of trudging through brush and uneven ground, they reached a clearing that looked disturbed, a shallow pit barely concealed beneath a layer of dirt, leaves, and branches. The unmistakable smell of decay hung heavy in the air, making their stomachs turn. Irina, the team leader, began carefully uncovering the soil with gloved hands, revealing fragments of bone and torn fabric. The other 2 officers documented everything meticulously, taking photographs and making notes on their findings. As they worked, a faint rustling came from the dense undergrowth just beyond the clearing. The 3 officers exchanged uneasy glances, but focused on their grim task, aware that the remote wilderness was home to many dangerous animals. What they did not know was that something far more immediate and lethal was watching them. Without warning, a massive Russian grizzly burst from the thicket, its powerful limbs smashing through branches and foliage. The bear was enormous, its fur a dark mottled brown with streaks of gray and blood-red stains around its jaws and paws. Its eyes glowed with fierce, predatory intent, and its heavy breath steamed in the cool air. The bear charged. Irina was closest and the first to be struck. The force of the impact threw her backward onto the leaf-strewn ground, the bear's jaws clamping onto her right arm and shoulder with crushing power. Bone shattered under the pressure, and blood gushed from deep wounds. Irina screamed, the raw terror in her voice cutting through the forest like a blade. Svetlana and Anna scrambled to respond, pulling their pistols and firing several warning shots into the air. Their voices rang out, sharp and commanding, trying to startle the bear away. Anna quickly deployed bear spray, releasing a dense cloud of irritant between them and the animal. For a brief moment, the bear recoiled, snarling and shaking its massive head as the chemical burned its eyes and nose.
Seizing the chance, Svetlana lunged to pull Irina free from the bear's deadly grip. But as she grabbed her partner's arm, a searing pain tore through her forearm. A brutal swipe from the bear's claw snapped bones and ripped flesh. Blood poured freely as Svetlana struggled to drag Irina backward.
The bear, however, was far from finished. With a furious roar, it lunged again, this time aiming at the rescuers. In the chaos, it caught Svetlana, dragging her screaming into the dense forest. Anna fired again, bullets thudding into thick fur, but the bear vanished into the shadows with its prey. Irina, barely conscious and soaked in blood, clung to life on the forest floor. Anna, shaken but determined, radioed for emergency assistance, her voice trembling as she relayed their dire situation. The forest fell eerily silent once more, save for the distant rustle of leaves and the faint cries carried on the wind. Search and rescue teams arrived hours later, guided by Anna's coordinates and the intermittent distress calls. They combed the dense forest with flashlights and tracking dogs, eventually finding Svetlana's mangled body deep among the trees. The bear's brutal attack had left no chance for survival. Irina was airlifted to the regional hospital, her injuries grave. Her arm was shattered beyond repair, her shoulder bones crushed, and her body bore multiple deep lacerations and bruises. Doctors called her survival remarkable, given the severity of the attack. Anna, though physically less wounded, suffered a broken wrist and severe emotional trauma. Officials later examined the scene with grim understanding. The bear had almost certainly been feeding on the decomposing body in the shallow grave before the officers' arrival. The scent of fresh human remains had likely triggered its aggressive, territorial response, an instinctive defense heightened by hunger and the proximity of its food source. Wildlife experts from the regional department emphasized that Russian grizzlies, while generally avoiding humans, can become unpredictably dangerous when provoked or threatened near carcasses. This tragic incident underlined the urgent need for law enforcement and search teams to coordinate with wildlife specialists and take extreme precautions in such remote wilderness investigations. The community mourned the loss of Svetlana Morozova, a respected and courageous officer whose dedication had inspired many. Irina Volkova, despite enduring excruciating physical and emotional pain, resolved to continue her duty, though with a deeper respect and wariness of the wilderness that had turned so deadly. Anna Petrov remained hospitalized, haunted by the memory of the attack and the loss of her partner, but determined to heal and carry on. This harrowing event echoed beyond the forests of Amur, a stark reminder of the peril that lurks where human lives intersect with nature's rawest forces. The early September 2024 night settled over the Blue Ridge Mountains with a quiet stillness that few outside the forest could understand. Towering oaks, maples, and birches stood sentinel around a popular camping site nestled in a wide clearing near a babbling creek. The leaves were just beginning their annual transformation, blazing crimson, gold, and orange in the soft autumn sunlight that filtered faintly through the mist as dawn approached. For most campers, it was the kind of morning that invited calm reflection, a chance to breathe fresh mountain air and soak in the peacefulness of the wild. Among those campers was Jason Collins, a 28-year-old who had never been what one would call an expert outdoorsman. He loved nature, but his knowledge of camping safety, especially in bear country, was limited. That weekend, eager for solitude and a break from city life, he had pitched a small tent near the creek and unpacked a modest cooler filled with food and snacks he planned to eat over the next 2 days. Despite warnings from park staff and signage about bears, Jason had left the cooler unsecured, placing it near his tent, trusting that nothing would come to disturb him. As the first faint light of dawn seeped through the canopy, the forest was still cloaked in a thin mist that curled and swirled softly in the cool morning air. Jason awoke with a hunger gnawing at his stomach. The night had been restless, and his body ached slightly from sleeping on uneven ground. Still half asleep, He swung his legs out of the tent and stepped toward his cooler, eager for a quick breakfast, before packing up and heading home. Near the edge of the clearing, close to where his cooler rested, something stirred in the low brush. Jason caught a glimpse of a dark shape moving slowly through the undergrowth. His heart skipped a beat, but he convinced himself it was a stray dog, or perhaps a curious raccoon drawn by the scent of food. He wasn't prepared for anything worse. "Hey, boy," he called softly, his voice sleepy but friendly, taking a few tentative steps forward. He expected the shape to approach cautiously or run away, but instead, the black silhouette moved deliberately closer. The outline grew larger, taller. Then suddenly, the shape exploded forward, a massive adult black bear crashing through the brush with terrifying speed and power. Jason barely had time to react before he was slammed to the ground with crushing force. The world spun violently as the bear's weight pinned him against the damp forest floor. Pain blossomed immediately, sharp, searing, and overwhelming. The bear's jaws clamped down hard on his left shoulder, teeth sinking deep into muscle and bone. His back was shredded as the bear's claws raked across it repeatedly, tearing flesh and ripping clothing. Jason's scream tore through the still morning, raw and desperate. Panic flooded his mind, but beneath the pain, a fierce instinct to survive ignited. He fought back with everything he had, thrashing and pounding at the bear's sensitive snout with his fists, trying to drive it away. The bear growled, snarling in frustration, but did not release its grip immediately. Nearby, other campers awoke to the terrifying noise. Shouts and cries echoed through the forest, pulling them from their tents and cabins. Within moments, they gathered pots and pans, banging them together loudly to scare the beast. Someone triggered a car alarm, adding a sharp, urgent noise to the clamor. The combined racket startled the bear, which snarled before finally releasing Jason and retreating into the dense woods. Jason lay on the ground, blood pouring from his wounds, every breath a struggle. His left arm hung awkwardly at an unnatural angle, a painful dislocation that sent shockwaves through his body with every movement. His clothes were torn, and his skin was cut and bruised in multiple places. Campers rushed to his side, calling emergency services on their phones and doing their best to comfort him. The morning air was thick with tension, disbelief, and fear. Jason's survival seemed tenuous as he was stabilized and prepared for evacuation. At the hospital, doctors worked tirelessly to mend the damage inflicted by the bear's attack. Deep lacerations covered Jason's shoulder and back, requiring extensive surgery to repair torn muscles and tissue. His left arm was set back into place after the dislocation, and several fractures in his shoulder blade and ribs demanded weeks of immobilization and physical therapy. Despite the severity of his injuries, doctors credited Jason's survival to the quick response of the campers and his determination to fight back during the attack. Wildlife officers later investigated the campsite. Their findings were grim but familiar. The black bear was almost certainly attracted by improperly stored food left unsecured in the cooler. Over time, bears that frequent heavily visited campsites can become habituated to human food sources, losing their natural fear of people and growing bolder in their attempts to access easy meals. Officials renewed urgent warnings to campers and hikers in the region about the importance of proper food storage, using bear-proof containers, hanging food away from tents, and never leaving scraps unattended. They emphasized that in areas where bears have become accustomed to human presence, even small lapses in safety can lead to dangerous encounters. For Jason, the attack was a harsh and painful lesson. Though he had loved the outdoors before, the experience changed his relationship with the wilderness forever. The memory of mistaking the bear for a dog, a moment of tragic misjudgment, haunted him in the weeks and months that followed. He spoke quietly about the terror, the pain, and the deep gratitude for the people whose swift action saved his life. The incident sparked broader conversations among park officials, campers, and local communities about the balance between human recreation and wildlife conservation. It underscored the critical need for education, vigilance, and respect for the wild inhabitants of the forests. As the Blue Ridge Mountains slowly slipped back into their ancient rhythms, with wildlife reclaiming the quiet spaces, the warning remained clear. No matter how familiar the forest may seem, it is home to powerful creatures governed by instincts older than time, and crossing paths with them demands humility, preparation, and respect. April was supposed to bring warmth and new life to the dense forests of the Central Indian Wildlife Sanctuary, a place where nature thrived in quiet balance. The sanctuary's marked trails, winding through thick undergrowth and towering trees, were popular with tourists seeking close encounters with the region's diverse and sometimes elusive wildlife. Birds chirped above, insects buzzed softly, and the forest floor was littered with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Yet beneath the forest's serene surface, danger waited in shadows few visitors anticipated. On the morning of April 9th, 2024, two foreign tourists named Mark and James began their guided hike with high hopes of experiencing the wild firsthand. Both men were in their early 30s, adventurous and eager to capture moments of untouched nature on camera. They had listened attentively to their guide, a seasoned local with years of experience in these forests, who had repeatedly warned them about the unpredictable nature of the sanctuary's inhabitants, especially the notoriously aggressive sloth bears. The day was bright and clear, with the sun filtering through the thick canopy and scattered rays. The forest seemed alive, vibrant with the sounds and smells of spring. Mark and James moved carefully along the trail, stopping often to marvel at the towering trees and colorful birds, unaware of how close they were to a dangerous encounter. As they approached a narrow bend, the trail suddenly plunged into a dense thicket of shrubs and low-hanging branches. Visibility dropped drastically, limited to mere feet ahead. Unseen in the thick brush was a female sloth bear and her two young cubs, quietly foraging on termite mounds hidden beneath the fallen leaves and tangled roots. The mother bear, alert but calm, was unaware of the humans approaching on the trail. Mark and James, unaware of the bear's presence, inadvertently stepped directly between the mother and her cubs. This critical mistake triggered the bear's most primal instincts of protection and territoriality. Without warning, the mother bear erupted from the undergrowth with a bone-chilling roar that echoed violently through the forest, shattering the tranquil morning. Birds scattered in all directions, and the trees seemed to tremble under the force of the bear's charge. For their part, Mark and James were caught completely off guard, the suddenness of the attack giving them no time to react. Mark was the first to be struck. The bear's massive bulk collided with him, knocking him to the ground with staggering force. Pain exploded as the bear's powerful jaws clamped down on his neck and upper back, teeth sinking deep into muscle and bone. He cried out in agony, his body twisting beneath the relentless onslaught as the bear bit and clawed mercilessly. James, horrified but determined to help, reached toward Mark, struggling to pull him away from the bear's grasp. In doing so, he too became a target. The bear's claws raked across his face, leaving deep, bloody gashes that stung sharply and blurred his vision. Blood poured freely as he fought to fend off the bear while trying desperately to help his friend. Their screams rang through the forest, raw and desperate, a piercing alarm that shattered the morning's calm. Nearby, their guide, alerted by the terrifying noise, rushed toward the scene, adrenaline flooding his veins. He knew any confrontation with a sloth bear was dangerous, but waiting was not an option. Pulling several firecrackers from his pack, he lit them and hurled them into the thicket. The explosions echoed sharply, bright flashes lighting the dark brush. The bear roared furiously, startled and disoriented by the sudden noise and light. After a tense moment, it released its victims and retreated with its cubs into the safety of the forest's dense shadows. Mark lay motionless on the forest floor, bloodied and barely conscious. James knelt beside him, his face swollen and bleeding, struggling to control the bleeding and keep his friend alert. The two men's lives hung in the balance as the forest returned to an eerie silence. Emergency services were alerted immediately, but the remote location meant that rescue took hours. Eventually, an air ambulance arrived, flying low over the dense canopy to reach the injured men. They were transported swiftly to a trauma center, where doctors faced a daunting task. Mark was in critical condition. He suffered deep puncture wounds, multiple fractures, and extensive tissue damage. His neck and upper back bore the scars of the bear's teeth, and blood loss had left him dangerously weak. Surgeons worked for hours to stabilize him, stitching torn muscles, setting broken bones, and battling infection risks. James, though physically less injured, required intensive treatment for multiple facial fractures and severe lacerations. Both men faced long recoveries, months of painful rehabilitation, and the psychological scars of a brutal encounter with a wild animal. Wildlife experts later examined the attack site and concluded that the sloth bear's aggression stemmed from being startled and its instinct to protect its young fiercely. These bears are well known for their unpredictable behavior, far more aggressive than many assume. When surprised or feeling threatened near their cubs, they can become violent in an instant, wielding powerful claws and crushing jaws capable of inflicting severe injuries within moments. The sanctuary's administration took the incident as a harsh lesson. Safety protocols were reinforced and publicized widely. Tourists must stay strictly on marked trails, avoid wandering off alone, keep noise levels steady to prevent startling wildlife, and never attempt to approach or separate a mother bear from her cubs. Guides were reminded to maintain vigilance and ensure groups moved cautiously through dense brush where visibility was limited. Mark and James's attack became a chilling reminder of the thin line humans walk when venturing into wild spaces. No matter how well planned or prepared, the unpredictable nature of wildlife can turn a peaceful adventure into a life-or-death struggle within seconds. For the survivors, the memory of the attack remained vivid and haunting. Mark spoke quietly of the pain and terror, of the helplessness he felt as the bear tore into his flesh. James reflected on the frantic moments spent trying to protect his friend while fighting off the relentless assault. Both men carried the physical and emotional scars of that day, a lasting testament to the power and unpredictability of the wild. As the forests of central India continued their timeless cycles, the story of the sloth bear attack spread among visitors and locals alike, a sobering tale underscoring the need for respect, caution, and humility in the face of nature's raw power. The sanctuary, a place of beauty and danger intertwined, remained a vital reminder. Here, humanity was only a visitor, and the wild demanded reverence, understanding, and the constant awareness that survival was never guaranteed. The Montana wilderness at dawn was a world caught between silence and sound, the dark coolness of night slowly surrendering to the faint golden light of morning. In the heart of this remote forest, a logging camp stirred awake with the steady rhythm of men who had long accepted the wilderness as both their workplace and an unpredictable neighbor. The scent of pine resin and damp earth filled the air, mingling with the smell of diesel and sawdust, an unusual harmony of nature and industry. Hank Mallory, the foreman of the crew, was no stranger to this land. Over more than a decade, he had guided teams through these forests, teaching younger men how to handle not just the timber, but the hazards that came with it. Bears were a known presence here, majestic, powerful, and potentially deadly if provoked or hungry. Yet no training or experience could prepare Hank for the sudden violence that would erupt at the edge of their camp one fateful morning. The crew worked with practiced efficiency. Under the pale light filtering through the dense pine canopy, chainsaws hummed steadily while the men moved logs, stacked lumber, and prepared the day's haul. Luis, a burly and seasoned logger, was nearby, lifting heavy pine trunks onto a waiting flatbed truck. His focus was sharp, his movements fluid with the muscle memory that came from years in the field. Suddenly, from the forest's shadowy edge, a sound erupted, something primal and terrifying. The underbrush exploded as a massive grizzly bear burst forth, charging into the camp with alarming speed and ferocity. Its fur was thick and mottled brown, its eyes wild and fierce. The sheer size of the animal, coupled with its sudden aggression, struck like a thunderclap. Hank barely had time to shout a warning. His voice was lost beneath the bear's roaring charge. Luis, closest to the attack, was caught completely off guard. The bear collided with Luis, slamming him against a towering pine tree with devastating force. The impact was bone-shattering. Luis screamed, raw, desperate, a sound filled with agony and shock. Blood poured from deep bite wounds along his torso as the bear's powerful jaws crushed flesh and cracked ribs. The force drove the breath from his lungs, sending waves of searing pain coursing through his battered body. Hank's heart pounded wildly. His hands shook as he reached for the bear spray strapped to his belt. Fumbling with adrenaline-fueled panic, he pulled the canister free and aimed it at the bear. The massive animal turned toward him, swiping violently with claws that shredded Hank's thick jacket and left painful welts blooming across his arm. The rest of the crew reacted instinctively. Shouts erupted, sharp and urgent, breaking the tension. Men grabbed emergency flares from their packs and fired them high into the air. Bright streaks of red and orange cut through the dawn's pale blue, their light illuminating the trees and casting flickering shadows. The bear hesitated. Its nostrils flared as it took in the chaos. Blaring colors, shouts, and flares unfamiliar and threatening in the early morning calm. Growling low and deep, the grizzly weighed its options. The moments stretched taut, heavy with suspense. Then, with a final guttural roar, the bear turned and retreated. It melted back into the forest shadows as quickly and silently as it had arrived. Paramedics rushed to Luis's side, his body weak but still alive. He was airlifted to the nearest trauma center, where doctors faced a critical battle to save his life. Deep puncture wounds, fractured ribs, and severe internal bruising marked his injuries. His condition was grave, and for days he hovered between life and death. Luis's survival was attributed to the crew's rapid response and Hank's quick thinking. The bear spray had bought them the crucial seconds needed to disrupt the attack. The emergency flares startled the bear enough to force it to withdraw, preventing further carnage. In the days that followed, wildlife officials investigated the cause of the attack. Their findings were troubling. Illegal baiting had been taking place near the camp. Hunters and others had been leaving food out to attract bears, disrupting their natural behavior. This practice made the animals bolder and aggressive around humans, increasing the risk of dangerous encounters. Hank reflected on that terrifying morning with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. The split-second decisions, the spray, the flares, the shouting, had saved lives. He credited the crew's quick actions and the team's calm under pressure as key to surviving what could have been a deadly massacre. The attack sent ripples through the local community and logging industry, sparking renewed discussions about wildlife safety and responsible behavior near habitats shared with dangerous animals. For those who worked in the wild, the event was a grim reminder that nature's power was ever present and that respect and caution were not just wise, they were essential. The forest reclaimed its quiet after the chaos. The towering pines stood as silent witnesses to the struggle between man and beast, their shadows lengthening in the growing light of day. And deep in the wilderness, the grizzly roamed once more, a reminder that the wild was alive, unpredictable, and not to be underestimated.